Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the slowest, quietest enemy you've ever faced has been living inside your mind for years, maybe your entire life. Not a disease, not a memory, not a traumatic event you can point to and say, that's when it started. No, this enemy doesn't storm the gates of your consciousness. It seeps through the cracks, drop by drop, until one morning you discover the fortress you thought was yours has been hollowed out from within. You might feel fine. You might laugh with friends, hit your deadlines, love your family, make plans for the weekend. But somewhere just beneath the surface, the mind has been drawing quiet maps toward its own ruin. Small compromises, half-truths, moments of silence when you should have spoken, times you walked away when you should have stayed. These aren't mistakes in the usual sense. They are subtle, almost invisible acts of betrayal committed against yourself. And you didn't even notice. What if the mind's greatest weakness isn't fear or laziness or ignorance, but its own brilliance? What if the very thing that makes you capable of hope, love, and creativity also carries within it a seed of self-destruction? We imagine self-destruction as dramatic, people hitting rock bottom, shattering their lives in an instant. But the truth is, the more intelligent, thoughtful, and self-aware you are, the more refined your path to destruction can become. You don't sabotage yourself with a gunshot to the heart. You do it with a paper cut to the soul, every day. Think about it. Every time you dismiss your own intuition because it's irrational, every time you give someone the benefit of the doubt at the expense of your own peace, every time you let an injustice slide because it's not worth the trouble, you lay down another tile on the road. It's so subtle, you might even call it maturity. You might call it being reasonable. But what if those words, reasonable, mature, patient, are just masks the mind wears to disguise the fact that it is moving steadily toward its own undoing? And here's the paradox. The mind is both architect and victim of this destruction. It builds the traps it will one day fall into, convincing itself the whole time that it's just making practical decisions. It whispers, "This isn't the right time to speak up," or "You're not ready yet, wait a little longer," or "It's better to keep the peace." But peace, at the cost of yourself, is just a quiet war you're losing without even realizing it. Somewhere deep inside, there is a part of you keeping score. A part that remembers every time you silenced yourself, every time you pretended you didn't care, every time you smiled when you wanted to scream. It doesn't rage, it doesn't protest, it just keeps the tally, and one day it cashes it in. That day doesn't look like an explosion. It looks like you staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., realizing you no longer recognize the person you've become. Have you ever met someone who seemed fine on the outside, only to later learn they were living in quiet misery? Maybe you've even been that person. The smile is perfect, the small talk is effortless.
Talk easy, but the eyes. The eyes have that faraway look, like they've been somewhere you don't want to go. That's the look of someone whose mind has walked them to the cliff's edge without ever sounding an alarm. We love to believe that self-destruction is about reckless choices and impulsive mistakes, but often it's about perfectly reasonable decisions, repeated just enough times in just the right way until there's nothing left. So I'll ask you, what if the greatest danger you face isn't the world outside, but the quiet erosion happening inside your own head? What if your mind has been teaching itself slowly how to disappear? Not with a bang, but with a whisper. And most importantly, if this is true, how do you know you're not already on that path? Because here's the most unsettling thought of all. You won't feel it happening until it's too late. The mind is too clever for that. It knows that if you saw the danger clearly, you'd fight it. So instead, it hides the rot under the paint. And that leads us to the question you may not want to ask, but can't afford to ignore. If your mind can so easily turn against you, then who or what can you trust to save you from yourself? The hidden problem and its psychological and philosophical roots. The first step in untangling this quiet form of self-destruction is to recognize that it isn't an accident, it's a design. Not one you consciously created, but one etched into the architecture of the mind over years, shaped by forces you didn't choose. Psychologists have a name for this kind of slow self-betrayal: learned helplessness. Martin Seligman's experiments in the 1960s revealed that when animals were repeatedly subjected to pain they could not escape, they eventually stopped trying. Even when escape was possible, the cages were open, the way out clear, but they didn't move. Something inside them had been rewired, the belief that action was pointless. Humans are no different, but our cages are not made of metal bars. They're made of invisible expectations, cultural conditioning, and unspoken rules about how life is supposed to be.
Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." That's the heart of it. Much of what you call yourself is a negotiation with the collective. You learn to speak in ways that don't make others uncomfortable, to want what is socially acceptable, to dream within the limits of what won't threaten anyone else's sense of normal. And in that negotiation, something gets lost. The raw, untamed instinct that once knew exactly who you were. Carl Jung described this as the process of building a persona, a mask we wear to interact with the world. The persona isn't inherently bad. Without it, we couldn't function in society. But here's the danger. Over time, the mask can fuse to the skin. You forget it's a mask at all. You think the role you play is you. And so the mind begins its subtle work. It tells you, don't say that, it'll make things awkward. Don't try that, it's too risky. Don't want that, it's unrealistic. Each of these is presented as wisdom, as maturity. But together, they're a slow hypnosis. You stop noticing the gap between what you want and what you allow yourself to want. Jean-Paul Sartre warned about this in his concept of bad faith, the act of lying to oneself to avoid the burden of freedom. Freedom, after all, is terrifying. If you admit you can change your life, you must also admit you're responsible for not doing it. And responsibility is heavy. So the mind invents excuses, dresses them in logic, and calls it peace of mind. Arthur Schopenhauer took an even darker view. He believed the human will is ultimately self-defeating, that we are driven by desires we can never fully satisfy, and that the endless pursuit of them leads only to suffering. In his worldview, the mind's path to self-destruction isn't a glitch, it's the default setting. But here's the most insidious layer. This isn't just personal psychology, it's cultural engineering. The systems we live in thrive when people doubt themselves just enough to stay compliant, but not enough to completely break. Capitalism needs you to want things you can never quite have. Politics needs you to feel powerless enough not to demand real change. Even relationships can thrive on a subtle imbalance of self-worth, where one person's uncertainty keeps them tethered. Aldous Huxley saw this coming in Brave New World. He imagined a society where people were controlled not by fear, but by pleasure, where they were too entertained, too distracted, too comfortable to notice they had no real freedom. That is the genius of the modern mind's self-destruction. It rarely feels like pain. It feels like scrolling through your phone until your dreams are too faint to recall.
This is why it's so difficult to see the hidden problem. It doesn't announce itself with disaster. It doesn't come with a villain you can point to. It comes as a whisper. This is just the way life is. But that whisper is a lie. The mind isn't inherently your enemy. It's simply following the programming it's received. If you've been taught that security matters more than fulfillment, your mind will protect you from risk, even when risk is the only thing that could save you. If you've been taught that kindness means self-sacrifice, your mind will push you to give until there's nothing left. If you've been taught that humility means shrinking yourself, your mind will make sure you never stand too tall. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, understood this deeply. He wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But here's the paradox. To change yourself, you must first admit that the self you've been living with is not the whole truth. That admission is terrifying. Because if you strip away the learned helplessness, the mask of the persona, the comfort of cultural approval, what's left? Who are you without the compromises, without the quiet surrenders, without the justifications? The answer is both liberating and dangerous. Because once you see the hidden problem for what it is, you can never go back to pretending you don't know. And that brings us to the next question, the one that will take us even deeper into the darkness. If the mind's self-destruction is not an accident, but a design, what happens when you start to notice the damage it has already done?
Neurologically, this makes sense. Studies on emotional regulation show that suppressing negative emotions doesn't just target the bad, it also dulls the good. When you teach your mind not to feel deeply in order to avoid pain, you also teach it not to feel deeply, period. The mind thinks it's protecting you. In reality, it's embalming you while you're still breathing. And here's where the consequences expand beyond the personal. Relationships suffer. Because how can anyone truly connect with you if you're not fully there? At first, people might just sense something's off. They'll describe you as distant, distracted, hard to read. Over time, that distance becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You avoid intimacy because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens the fragile equilibrium you've built. Even worse, you begin to attract what mirrors your own disconnection, relationships built on convenience rather than depth, partnerships where both people are quietly performing roles rather than living as their whole selves. Sartre might say you've entered a mutual pact of bad faith, two actors agreeing never to break character. Then there's the societal level. A population full of self-alienated, emotionally numb individuals is the perfect audience for distraction and control. People who've lost touch with themselves don't demand much. They buy, they consume, they nod along. They're too busy maintaining the fragile truce with their own minds to challenge the narratives handed to them. This is what Huxley feared more than Orwell's brute force control. Not a world of oppressed rebels, but a world of compliant dreamers lulled into submission. The fourth consequence is the most subtle and the most fatal: loss of agency. It doesn't happen in one dramatic surrender. It's chipped away by tiny abdications. You let your boss make unreasonable demands because you don't want conflict. You let a friend take advantage of your time because they need you more than you need rest. You let your health slide because there's no time to take care of yourself right now. Each one feels small, but together they form a habit of surrender. And habits become identities. One day you no longer see yourself as someone who can make bold choices, take risks, or draw hard boundaries. You've internalized the belief that life happens to you, not through you. The final consequence is the most devastating, and it rarely announces itself until it's too late: existential despair. This is the moment when the hum of wrongness turns into a roar you can't name,
Can't ignore. It might come as a midlife crisis, a sudden burnout, or a quiet morning when you realize you've been living on autopilot for decades. It's the moment you ask yourself, how did I get here? And you realize the answer isn't one event, it's every moment you didn't notice slipping away. Nietzsche would argue that this despair is the inevitable result of avoiding the confrontation with your own truth. When you refuse to face your inner chaos, you also refuse the possibility of transformation. You become, in his words, the last man, comfortable, safe, and utterly devoid of the will to transcend. The tragedy is that most people will never name this despair. They'll call it stress, boredom, or bad luck. They'll blame their job, their partner, their city, their age, anything but the truth, that the slow erosion happened because they never learned to protect themselves from their own mind. And yet, here lies the opening. Because once you do see the consequences, once you name them, you can no longer dismiss them as fate. You can trace them back to their source. You can ask the most dangerous question of all. If my life is the result of my mind's subtle self-destruction, what happens if I stop playing along? That question is a spark, but a spark is nothing if it isn't fed. And feeding it will mean breaking rules you've lived by for years. It will mean betraying the version of yourself who agreed to all the quiet compromises. It will mean starting a rebellion, not against society, but against the programming in your own head. The rebellion. How to break free. Rebellion doesn't begin with a manifesto. It begins with a decision so small it almost feels laughable, yet it shifts the axis of your life. It begins with saying no where you once said yes without thinking. It begins with telling the truth when a lie would be easier. It begins with listening to the faint voice you've been drowning in noise for years. Breaking free from the mind's subtle path to self-destruction is not about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you were before you learned to disappear.
And to do that, you must be willing to violate the unwritten contracts you've made with yourself and the world. Step 1. Break the pact of silence. The mind thrives in secrecy. The unspoken compromises, the swallowed opinions, the feelings you bury. These are its currency. To rebel, you must speak, not loudly at first, but honestly. Tell someone the truth about what you've been feeling, even if it's uncomfortable. Tell yourself the truth about what you want, even if you don't yet know how to get it. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Speaking is the act of dragging the unconscious into daylight. Once it's out there, it can't hide in the shadows where self-destruction grows. Step 2. Commit small acts of disobedience. You don't dismantle years of mental conditioning overnight. The rebellion begins with micro-interruptions in the pattern. If you always defer to others, decide the next restaurant, the next movie, the next vacation. If you always agree to work late, decline just once and walk out the door. These acts may seem petty, but they signal to the mind that its old programming is no longer law. You're introducing chaos, not the destructive kind, but the creative kind. Nietzsche called this the birth of the Übermensch, the person who writes their own values rather than inheriting them. Step 3. Practice the discipline of desire. One of the reasons self-destruction is so effective is that it convinces you to abandon your desires before they ever have a chance to grow. The rebellion is not just about protecting your desires, it's about training yourself to pursue them with precision. Write them down. Define them in detail. If your mind tries to edit them into something more realistic, notice it and resist. Schopenhauer might warn that desire inevitably leads to suffering, but he'd also admit that without desire, there is no movement, no life. Your rebellion is choosing to suffer in the direction of something worth suffering for. Step 4. Build an inner court of truth-tellers. Self-destruction thrives in isolation. When you're the only one in your head, your thoughts can loop unchecked. Surround yourself with people who will not let you shrink.
Cheerleaders who will blindly agree with you, but truth-tellers,
People who will call you out when you retreat into old patterns, who will remind you of who you are when you forget. Viktor Frankl said, "An abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior." If you've been living in a self-erasing mental loop, rebelling against it will feel abnormal. You'll need people who can hold the line when your own courage falters. Step 5. Embrace productive discomfort. This is where most rebellions die. The first taste of discomfort comes, and the mind whispers, "See, this is why we kept things safe." But discomfort is not proof you're failing, it's proof you're stepping into territory the old you never dared to enter. Think of it like muscle growth. You don't get stronger by doing what's easy, you get stronger by enduring controlled strain. Every awkward conversation, every decision that makes your voice shake, every boundary you set that feels like a betrayal to your old self, it's all part of the training. Step 6. Reclaim your time as a sovereign resource. The mind's path to self-destruction thrives when your time is scattered. Endless scrolling, habitual procrastination, filling your calendar with obligations that mean nothing. These are all ways it keeps you from noticing the erosion. To rebel, you must treat your time like territory that must be defended. Block hours for thought, for creation, for nothingness. Don't explain it. Don't apologize. You cannot rebuild a self while renting out every hour to someone else's agenda. Step 7. Choose a higher allegiance. Here's the truth. You can't just break free from something, you have to break free into something. Without a higher allegiance, rebellion collapses into chaos. That allegiance could be to your values, to your art, to your faith, to the version of yourself you know you can become. For some, it's a spiritual awakening. For others, it's a radical commitment to a cause. For you, it might simply be the quiet vow, "I will not abandon myself again." This rebellion is not a single act, it's a way of living. And the danger is that your mind will try to claim victory too soon. It will say, "You spoke up once, you took a stand once, that's enough." But this is not a war you win once. This is a frontier you patrol every day. Because the old pathways don't vanish. They remain, waiting for a moment of fatigue, a season of stress, an old wound reopening. And in those moments, you must choose again. Not the easy choice, not the safe choice, the choice that costs you, but costs you in the direction of becoming whole. And if you can sustain that rebellion long enough, something extraordinary happens. You discover that the mind, once your greatest saboteur, can be retrained into your fiercest ally. But before that transformation can occur, you must face the final, most dangerous realization of all, the one that will not only change how you see your mind, but how you see reality itself.